Hey, so about 3 months ago, I posted this video trying to emulate some Houdini smoke in Blender. And while it was definitely a cool process learning all of that, and I did learn a lot about the Blender internal smoke, it was so heavy, and it was honestly a really hard project for a lot of you guys to follow along with, and unfortunately I kind of knew that going into the video. But by complete happenstance, I found a way to create a very similar effect that is much less taxing on your system. It's also incredibly easy to do. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and hop into this. So to start off, we are going to create just some interesting kind of abstract mesh. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come over to preferences. You're going to type in add and you're going to scroll down until you see geodesic domes. Is I think how you say this? So just go ahead and click that little checkbox there. And if we tab out of that, come back into our regular scene. If we were to get in some, spawn in some regular mesh, we could scroll all the way down here to geodesic dome. And if we open up this little menu on our bottom left, we have all of these options now. Now by default, I think this spawns in as a triangle, but I was already playing around a little bit. So you just up your frequency to get it to turn into a sphere. And since we're going for some abstract kind of mesh here, feel free to play around with some of these settings. So for me, these are the settings that I'm going to be using here. I've left main and geodesic the same. I went with class 1, tetrahedron, edge up and try, and then I changed my frequency to 3. And this just gives us like an odd little shape that you wouldn't normally come across in Blender, and very little work, just a good starting block. So what I'm going to do is scale this guy up a little bit. I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to take this duplicated version and slide it off over here, just in case we need it later. We always have something to come back to. And the reason we might need it later is because we're going to start adding our modifiers. We're going to come over here and we are going to add a wireframe modifier. After that, we're going to add a solidify modifier and set your thickness to a negative value. I've meant set to -0.1. And the reason we're going to do that is because if we set it to a positive value, we get a lot of clipping in the mesh, and we do not really want that. From there, we can go ahead and apply these modifiers. After that, what we're going to want to do is switch over to the sculpting tab, and we're going to come over here to remesh. And this is going to be a little bit personal to your computer and what your computer can handle, but you're going to want to remesh and play with your voxel size. We want a little bit of mesh here to work with. Now, in theory, most computers should be able to handle this just fine, so I wouldn't worry too much. We're going to start with 0.07, and you can see that this kind of turns everything into one mesh. It gets rid of some of the dips and crevices that the wireframe modifier causes. It also adds some just kind of general unevenness. We get weird little shapes like this, which are very abstract and unique. You can see it's only on 2 panels. Actually, it's on 3. I lied to you. But yeah, remesh is definitely a good technique for creating some randomness if you're looking to start with abstract mesh. And you can do it more than once. So let's say 0.07 is a shape that we like. We can now increase our voxel size. Or I guess decrease because we want smaller voxels, but you get what I'm saying here. So if we went 0.03 and then remeshed again, you can see that we've added a lot more geometry to this. Friendly reminder, good time to save your project file if you have not already. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come over to dynamic topology. We're going to enable this guy, and we're going to change relative detail to constant detail, and we're going to change our resolution to something maybe 40. Now again, if this gets too heavy, just lower that number and you will be okay. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go around with our smooth brush and just kind of smooth out some areas where it feels like we could add a little bit more. And you can see it gets this kind of stretchy, painting kind of effect. You can also, with the smooth brush, kind of create little curves and crevices and things. I really like how this looks, so I'm just going to go ahead and do this all around. And again, you can't really do this too wrong, so just kind of have fun with it and make some shapes you like. All right, so this is what I've ended up with. Nothing too special, didn't put too much time into this, couple of minutes. And you can see that we've kind of thinned out a lot of these shapes. They've been stretched out into more rounded triangles, and it's just a more unique shape overall. So some of you might be wondering why we turned dynamic topology on, because it doesn't really have an effect when you're using the smooth brush, and that is because we're going to come through with the clay tool now, and we are going to create some separation in here. And you'll find that with dynamic topology, if you're going over thin areas like this, you can separate them. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to go through and pick out some lines and just kind of add at random, just little separations and pieces that are kind of drifting away from each other. You can also add some, further details to the rest of the mesh if you want to. I probably won't be doing too much of that though, because I don't want things to get too heavy. And here we are. After some playing around, you can see I added a little bit of separation, a little bit more detail here and there, and we're looking pretty good. But in reality, all we've done is add a cool base mesh, because now we are going to work our way into the volume aspect of this tutorial. So what we are going to do next is we are going to spawn ourselves in a volume empty. Now this is super cool and has tons of possibilities, but what we are going to be using it for today is over here under our modifier tab. We're going to be using mesh to volume. And what this allows you to do is instance any piece of mesh and turn it into a volume. So if you take your little eyedropper here and we just select our mesh, you can see there we go. We've got our little bounding box and our volume inside it. So for now, what we are going to do is we are going to turn off our original sculpt so that we just have our volume open. We're going to click on this and we can increase our density a little bit so that we can see it a little bit better. We can also increase our voxel count to something maybe like 100 just to see the shape a little bit more defined. However, I warn you, the higher your voxel amount is, the heavier your scene will be. So while we're working on this, maybe we keep this at something like 70. And then for the final render, we're going to crank it up to somewhere between like 250 and 300. All right, so what I'm doing here is just building out a basic scene. I'm turning my world light value down to 0, adding a couple of lights just so that we can better see what's going on. I find it's best when you're working with volumes to work with a total black background just while you're kind of getting the shape and feel right. All right, so now that we have that set up, the first thing I'm noticing is this is a little bit too blocky. So maybe 70 was a little low. Maybe I'm going to go back up to 100 for now because my computer can handle it. And we're going to start working on adding some more dimension to this. And how we're going to do that is with the volume displace modifier. Now, this is a super cool modifier that works exactly like displace does with mesh. However, you have more possibilities, in my opinion, because with a volume, it stretches and fills gaps and you don't have kind of clipping of the mesh as you would if, you were working with geometry. So you can get these really kind of crazy abstract looking things that kind of look like they could really exist. So what we're going to do is we are going to create ourselves a new texture, and you can see it's immediately done something. We're going to click these little buttons over there and we're going to drop down and start working on a noise texture. Now, feel free to play around here as much as you want and just kind of go crazy with this. For me, if we would just say click clouds right off the bat, you can see that this adds a ton more dimension to our volume. And you could really kind of go crazy with this, where you can create some very, very abstract shapes. Or you can create some relatively low effort, high detail, high performance clouds that are super easy. And you don't have to do any simulations, which is kind of like a huge plus in my book. But you guys know me, I love doing goofy little abstract things. So for me, I'm going to be using a Voronoi texture, and you might be looking at this thinking, well, that's not very abstract, but we can make it abstract by increasing the intensity. And it gets abstract and cool very quickly. Now you can see with our voxel count not being very high, it kind of looks a little bit blocky. So maybe we turn this up just a little bit more again. Again, be careful, kind of go off of your own system. Don't push it too high too fast. So with a little bit of playing around in your Voronoi texture, you can change your coloring setting to position and outline. You can also play with your feature weights, and each one of these is going to give you like a slightly different shape and a different output. So kind of play around with these and see what you're looking for, what you're liking. You can also play around with the sizing of your Voronoi texture, and this will dramatically change how it looks. If we increase this up, you can see we start to get a very similar effect to what was happening in our thumbnail. Some things that we can kind of do to help this is increasing our density. If we were to go to say something like 10, you can see that this starts to fill out so much more. You can also play with your exterior bandwidth, and this will kind of give you more of a smoky plume feel, if that's something that you're looking for. And now if we greatly increase our voxel count to something like 500, you can really see this like abstract shape coming to be that you couldn't create something like this with a mesh without it looking so out of place and weird. But because it's a volume, it's like kind of believable in a weird sci-fi way. Again, 500 is a little bit heavy while we're working, so I'm going to drop this back down to 150. We're also going to pull our camera back a little bit in preparation for adding our second volume. Except this time, instead of instancing on our abstract object, we are going to be instancing on this object that we made earlier and set off to the side. So let's move that guy back to 0, 0. We're going to select our second volume empty. We're going to go back over to add modifiers, and we're going to add a mesh to volume modifier just like last time. And we are going to instance that object. Now we can go ahead and turn that off for now, and you can see that we've got smoke in the center of our guy again. Now the reason we're doing this is because I want the smoke to look like it's kind of coming from somewhere. That way it's a little bit more grounded and rooted in reality. Now something we can kind of do is play around with the scaling of this object, because as you know, we are instancing it, so our volume is going to take place with whatever our mesh is. So if we scale this up and down and then turn it off again, it affects our volume. I want this to be just a little bit smaller than our abstract volume. That way, when we're playing with it, it's a little bit more, like I said, coming from something. And we want this to be just a little bit smaller than our abstract volume. That way it acts as kind of like the core smoke object. And now on this one, we are also going to add a volume displace, and we're going to add a new texture. We're going to click our little button again. And on this one, we might work our way around to working on more of a real kind of cloud. So I'm going to turn off our first volume for a little bit, just so I can get this shape a little bit better. All right, so with a little bit of playing, this is what I think I'm going to go with for our internal volume. I added one volume displace with these base settings here, and we're going to switch over to our texture. We used a Musgrave set to Blender Original and FBM. Here are settings for our size. And this is just to kind of give us that that wavy kind of smoke look. I find that that kind of helps a little bit with the realism. And then on top of that, we added a second volume displace, and this is going to help give us some of that like wispy kind of smoke, you know, like it's blowing in the wind. So again, there are the settings for that. And if we come over into our texture, we can see that it is a distorted noise set to Voronoi F1 and Voronoi F4 with our amount and size available here. Now, if we turn both of these back on, you can see that it's definitely abstract and a little bit weird, maybe a little bit too messy, and we can kind of work on that a little bit. I have a few tricks. So the very first thing that we can do is come over to both of our volumes and increase our voxel count to something like 500. Now, this is definitely a little bit heavy while we're working the scene, but this is just so that we can better visualize what we're actually working on. We are going to turn this back down. So from there, something that we can do is play around with our mid values. And what this actually does is change the location of our volume. So you can see as we increase these, it kind of changes the value of where it's sitting a little bit. And this can help to add some breakup if these are the two different smokes are on different values. It can also change your output and act kind of like a seed generator. If you're on something where you're like, I like the effect, but it's not quite in the right position, try playing around with some of these numbers. You might find that you like something better just by changing these around a little bit. So with our base shape kind of created, let's start working on some of the materials that I used for the volume. Now, I just pulled this one in from my thumbnail project file, and you can see it's a very simple material. We're taking two different principal volumes, feeding them into a mix shader, and then we're mixing them via our texture coordinate and mapping nodes, plugged into a Musgrave texture, plugged into our color ramp. And if we switch over to rendered mode, you can see that this is where our colors are coming from. So with our color ramp, just like any other material that you've seen me make here before, you could move around your sliders to kind of adjust the fade on these. And something that I did on our principled volumes is increasing our density values. It will make your scene a little bit heavier when you're in rendered mode. However, I do think that it makes the smoke look a little bit more like, almost like egg crate foam, if you know what I'm talking about. I'll try to find a picture and put it on screen. It starts to look a little bit less like smoke, but a little bit more cool. I don't know. I just really like it. Again, if you're looking for more like traditional smoke, lower the density of the volume. It's totally fine. And as for our Musgrave texture here, all this is adding a little bit of randomness into how it's being separated. You can see that if you increase your size here a little bit, you know, you play around with your detail scaling, it's all going to change how this is getting faded between the two of them. And if you don't like the way that the Musgrave is looking, you can change it out for, say, a Voronoi texture, you know, just drop this guy in, and it's the same kind of thing. All right, so with both of our volumes turned on, you can see it's a little bit heavier in the viewport than it was just navigating regular, but totally workable, definitely manageable. And yeah, I do think it looks very cool. The only other thing that I did in the thumbnail scene was I turned back on the abstract model and I added my original glass shader version 1 to it. These are the base settings that I used for the roughness, IOR, and value, pretty default, and then I changed the red ever so slightly, just so that it's a little bit more pink in its refraction color. And if we turn this back on, you can now see it there in the center. As for the lighting in the thumbnail, I had a pretty similar lighting setup to what I have here. However, if you want to see the exact lighting setup, you know, the project files are available on my Patreon. But something that I did do was I put a light in the center of our volume here. And now for this one, I'm not totally certain if I like the light in the center. It kind of gets rid of too much of the depth of the smoke. So something that I might want to do is click on our volume number 2 and increase the density. You guys might have just seen a Discord message pop up from my friend Stu, who's a fellow 3D artist. So if you made it this far in the video, can you leave a comment that says, Stu, it'll never end, the render's gonna take forever? I think that that's very funny. Sorry. Anyways, our density, we can increase this a little bit to maybe something like 3, and it'll give us back some of the breakup that we were losing by adding that light in the center. You can see it kind of increases our shadow value over here, and I really like the way that that looks. And after playing with some settings, I ended up with this. Now, I tried a few different versions of this before I landed on this one, and you'll see in the thumbnail, I like that one a little bit more. However, it was just a lot of playing around with the noises and the displacements to decide what I really wanted out of the effect, and I think we got a pretty good thing going here. Total render time on these was about 25 minutes, give or take a couple, you know? Now that is a little bit long, but I rendered to 8K samples. You don't have to do that, but I thought it was necessary because it is a still. And either way, I think it turned out pretty good. However, if you want to know more details about how I got the thumbnail to look the way that it did, that project file, as well as the project file that we went over in this video, are available on my Patreon. Speaking of my Patreon, thank you to my patrons for making this possible and continue to support me. I can't express enough how much I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you again real soon.